Indeed. So this is the Praxis Book Club discussing Jeremy Lent's The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. So here we are. Maybe it's another planet. So the way we might discuss this book, I mean, I know we all have particular ideas that we want to bring up to Jeremy, and I have some that I have questions about, and I'm sure you do too. But I wanted to ask you, do you want to go through it first with ideas, or would you prefer to, what happened to Matt? Okay, he's going to try and get back on. Whether we should go through it from just the ideas we want to discuss first, or if we should go through it chapter by chapter. Does anyone have any input or ideas about that?
Well, do we even have time to go through chapter by chapter?
Well, I don't know. And if we don't, we could also continue it. We could continue the discussion. I think the book is important enough. I assume you all think so too, right?
Yes, of course.
Yes, of course. That we may want to do that, but mostly I want to see if that's a way that you would be interested in proceeding.
I would prefer going by ideas.
Okay. Do you have this? Did anyone else take notes on the book?
Yeah, I have a few notes. Let me see, or they're all clips. You know,
Okay, well, did anyone else do it? No.
Yeah, I took some notes.
I figured you did. Okay, so let's go this way. What is one particular thing you would want to bring up with Jeremy when he's on the call? What idea or what ideas that came out that you would want to discuss with him or get more clarification or just have a discussion about? Does anyone want to chime in about one thing first that you would be interested in talking to him about?
Well, if all would come about as he has visioned, how would we be living?
That's your question.
Yeah.
Now, let me go back. The reason why I think ideas versus chapter by chapter is an interesting process, and I really want you guys to think about it and kind of vote on it, is that if we do it chapter by chapter, we're going to cover everything. If we do it, that's why I think that might be a more systematic way to go about it. And maybe we can do one idea first from each person and then go chapter by chapter. So input. Kathy, Jeffrey, John. Matt's trying to get back on, but he's having trouble.
I think if we do chapter by chapter, it is going to be a lot longer.
So, yeah, I'm happy to
yes
start
or no.
I'm happy to start digging into one of mine if and no one else wants to start off. I mean,
well, this seems to be the dilemma, to do ideas or chapter by chapter.
I think you had a good structure suggestion. Do a couple ideas by everyone, and if that doesn't spurn enough tertiary discussion, we can go chapter by chapter.
Great. Okay, good. I think that's good input. Okay, so who has an idea that they want to discuss today, or they want to have Jeremy chime in on? Don't talk all at once.
Okay, so
the individual versus the social is pretty critical.
Okay, that's what you want to bring up with him?
Yes.
Okay, I think that really shows itself in the vaccination process, doesn't it?
Yes.
It really does. I mean, there we've got an example right in front of us.
It's the vaccination, and it also is critical in the climate
Yes,
debate.
we're dealing with.
He's obviously very aware, very into the whole climate problem.
Yes.
Well, I would stick with my same question. I mean, I would modify it a bit. I mean, what will life be like 10 years from now if his book has the impact he hopes it will. And I hope it will.
Mhm. Okay. Kathy?
I mean,
Don?
sorry, I think he lays it out in the last chapter of what life would be like: universal healthcare, universal housing, a fundamental realignment of incentives to recognize that the environment and the planet has a rights similar to humans have rights. He outlines pretty well in the last chapter some of the structural changes that we would make. And in short story is, it's basically socialist, not social, democratic socialist Bernie Sanders type of stuff, provide for everyone, and then UBI stuff like that. And first get rid of GDP and start using, I forget what the GDI or something like that. I
GDI,
forget.
yeah,
PI.
Indices, yes.
genuine
Yeah.
progress indicator.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's my instinct.
I agree with you, John, completely. I mean, those are things I've
So that's what it would look like,
for
I
50
think.
years. But does he see this entire list being put into action in the next 10 years, or even one thing? How does he see it? He wrote it.
Okay, well, we'll ask
Well,
him.
the likelihood of it happening.
Well,
That's the critical
he
point.
wrote
The likelihood of
the
it happening.
last chapter. He put
Okay,
the
everyone's talking at once. Let's get one person at a time. Rocky?
wish list, John. And is it possible to all occur in 10 years? I've been rooting for 50 years, even longer than that. But how does he see it? He's very sensitive to these issues, and he has a very long-term sense of humankind, John. And he can really see how the directions that we took, especially at the dawn of agriculture, has shaped us continuously to this very day. So I'd like to know what he sees for the next 10 years.
I think before we even get to that question, we really have to look at what he wrote about, or how we even create the ecological environment for anything to change. I think that's what is so important about his book, is that he talks about how systemic change really can happen. And I think we have to understand that process really well. And I think what you're going to, Rocky, is the last chapter of the book. And this is why I think we need to also look at what precedes that, how he sees an ecological civilization being possible.
Yes, I agree completely. That's an even better idea than mine.
Well, it just comes before yours. I don't think it's better than. It's just, it's timing here. So Kathy, Matt, or Linda, any input on what you would like to discuss with Jeremy when he gets on the call? Kathy, you look like you want to talk, but I'm not hearing you. You need to unmute, Kathy. You're just talking and no one's
Here we
hearing
go.
you.
Okay, sorry. I think what I would like to ask him, because I found, I think knowing what to do and then doing it are two different things. I think you could know the answer to everything, but if you don't know how to get to it, it's like impossible. So I don't think unless he's really has, maybe that'd be a good question to ask him, but I find that knowing the answer is good enough. And the one thing that impressed me the most, is I think until we feel ourselves a part of nature, and that's a huge, deep connection, because that's basically what all these philosophies are, is that we are no different than the ants and the bees, and every time we disturb something, we disturb. And so the whole idea since the 16th century or the 17th century, whatever, was that we saw ourselves outside of nature. Mm-hmm. So and I think, and I don't know, I think nature will take care of that. I think nature will say to us, guess what? You're part of us. And I mean, that's a horrible thing to say, but we're witnessing it now. And hopefully with the fires and the tornadoes and the floods, it would be nice to see a philosophical and an old way of thinking get in the mainstream. So,
Well,
but
one
I
thing,
would
okay.
be curious if he thinks that's possible or if we're at that point yet.
Well, he brings up a really interesting point toward the beginning of the book, which is the scientific, what has been the scientific way of looking at the world, which is this reductionist view.
Yeah.
And that is what we have to really overcome, is that
Right.
tendency to reduce everything to its smallest units. It's kind of like the digital reality has taken over, and it's the natural progress from the reductionist thinking originally, which came from Plato and Descartes, and it's just been up leveled for each generation, but it hasn't gone away. So that's one of the blocks that I think we can talk to him about, is this scientific reductionism versus understanding the wholeness. Looks like
Right.
Matt's trying to come in yet again. What do we have, Matt, twice? Not quite sure what's going on. Okay. Linda, do you want to say anything?
Yes, I'll come in a minute when I'm back home, but I would like to simply say or ask Jeremy what his solution is to the changing of consciousness, because from my way of looking at it, it's got to be done collectively, and he really doesn't offer, even towards the end of the book, any solution other than maybe mindfulness. That's not going to do it. I'm sorry. And you had said, Georgia, the other day, I guess it was just Friday, dialogue's not going to do it because it's going to take too long. Well, what else is going to do it? So that would be my question.
Great. And actually keep track of your questions, because when Jeremy comes in, then you're all going to get called on to bring them up. I've got some that are might seem nitpicking compared to the ones that you guys have, which are much larger questions on one level. But there are things I want to understand. I don't know if anyone else had the problem with the Yossarian story. Did anyone notice that or have any question about it?
What was it again?
Yossarian in Catch-22. I never read the book Catch-22, but he makes the point that Yossarian, because he doesn't see any reason to fight in the war, and I assume it's the Second World War, and opts out of it, that it's kind of an individualistic decision that doesn't consider the culture or the society. And I don't totally agree with that. I think there's a place for an individual to make a decision of not participating in a war that's not just an individualistic decision. It's also part of a whole. I think it can be. So that's a question I have where I didn't quite agree with what Jeremy came up to with it. It doesn't look like anyone else had that problem.
Well, it was part of my individual versus the social dilemma.
Can you speak up a little bit, Jeffrey?
It was part of my question about the balance between the individual and the social, which is a fairly critical issue. The individual, in the case of Catch-22, the individual decision not to fight, or an individual decision not to worry about not to participate in the vaccination for COVID, versus the social demand that there's that cohesion necessary in order to overcome crises.
So do you see Yossarian in that same thing as an anti-vaxxer?
Yeah, I see it as the same dilemma, the individual versus the social.
Well, what about Vietnam? Someone who didn't participate in the Vietnam War.
Same. I mean,
Yes,
there's an individual decision. There's a decision whether it's Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. There are individual decisions that are made balancing your individual necessities to the social necessities.
Well, those wars were not social necessities.
Well, according to not according to us, but according to some people they were.
Well, that's where the individual has to make a decision to decide that. That's what I would think.
Right, the individual makes a decision.
Yeah,
But there is that social pressure, there is that social component there.
right. Yeah, to me, that could be a long discussion just in and of itself. Maybe
It's
we'll do
critical
that.
in terms of how this dilemma is going to be resolved.
Yeah. I mean, there's certain things that are more obvious than others. They all have social consequences, but some individual decisions can be individual decisions and still be the right decisions. They're not all bad because the social pressure. Yeah.
No, I agree.
Okay, so another thing I found really interesting that I wanted to talk to him about was the idea of negative entropy. I had never heard that term before.
Yeah.
Have any of you? That life itself proves there's negative entropy?
Right. And that we're going to dissolve eventually.
Eventually there will be entropy,
Yeah.
but right now there isn't.
It's a really interesting idea that all of life pushes back against the force of expansion and dissipation. You know,
Mhm.
that's a really cool idea.
Very interesting. Okay, anything else you want to bring up to Jeremy? Because we don't want to forget these ideas. There's so
He
much
talks about-
philosophy. Actually, an interesting thing that Bill Clay sent, because he can't be here, he said when he was looking up the book online, that it seems to fall into the categories of self-help. And he thought that was really odd, that it belonged more in philosophy or history. And he wanted to know what Jeremy thought of that, falling into that category, which seems bizarre to me. I don't know.
Sorry, one more time. He said this falls into.
He said
What kind of-
online, when they're categorizing his book, it's in the area of self-help books, which is really bizarre.
I can see that. It's a way to, it's a way to restructure your thinking such that you don't fall prey to that Uncle Bob fatalism thinking. I can totally see that. It's a new way to think. It's a way to structure your life. It's a way to think about the problems at large. I can definitely see it as, but I mean, then again, book categorization is as arbitrary as I can probably imagine. Besides fiction and nonfiction, that's that's a pretty arbitrary label. So I wouldn't put too much stock into that now that I think about it.
Just seems more like philosophy to me.
It makes me wonder if the decision about what category to put the book into was made by a bot or an algorithm.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right, yeah.
So many things these days you hear that it's not a person making a decision. It's there's a software, they put software that makes, there's, like for books, there's thousands of titles being published all the time, but they really have an individual go and decide what category everything's in. No, it could be it's all made by a.
So most of the time, if it's not a bot, it's just you roughly aggregate and extrapolate from user suggestion. Like if 5 users have reviewed the book and 3 suggest one category, 2 suggest the other, the website will list it as whatever the 3 people suggested it as. So again, really, it's a fairly arbitrary distinction in whatever realm you're measuring it. But in my mind, a couple important ideas from the book are the way things are connected is more important than the individual nodes he often refers to them as. And this again is kind of weird to me because he mentions again near the end of the book how valuable the internet is as a mechanism for distribution and organization and all this in the same breath that he's making us wary of technology as a solution to anything idea. So I'm really interested in what good, where he sees the limit in that is because he mentions things like Facebook, if they could be co-opted by the users, and if instead of being a mechanism for 100 billionaire to disseminate propaganda that either enriches himself or in a broader sense enacts that future where there's walled communities with genetically engineered people, and then there's slums in the rest of the world. I think he's really onto something there with co-opting the means of connection, and that starts with the internet and social media. I mean, look at what we're using to talk right now.
He also mentions that Facebook could become part of the commons rather than be individually owned or owned by a corporation. When you mentioned geoengineering, he said something about geoengineering, and these ideas come out of, again, that reductionist way of looking at the world. And that's kind of the digital market, that not being able to see the whole, but to break down everything into its individual pieces. I think that's a really important concept, because we're going to be coming up against scientists who promote geoengineering, the darkening of the sky to prevent the sun from heating up the planet more. So I think we're going to be coming up against a lot of these reductionist so-called solutions to the climate crisis, and we need to be prepared to talk about them and write about them and educate people about them, because they are the ones that would destroy the planet probably. Okay, so I know Jeremy's coming in soon. Anything else?
I want to just add one thing so we don't say it. The book, actually, the publishers classified this book as social science.
Oh, okay, good.
So we don't offend him by saying it was so I don't know where Bill saw that, but a bookstore could have, but it's considered social science.
Okay, good. Well, that makes much more sense. Yeah, maybe it was Amazon that put it in self-help. Who knows? It was an online thing that he was referencing.
Yeah, like Matt said, the algorithms. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
But the publisher.
I wouldn't put stock in it. Rocky, you're muted, by the way. I don't know if you saw the chat, but
No, I just wanted to mention, John, long before you were born, the internet was owned by the American people.
Mhm,
So with the airwaves.
mhm.
right. So one of the big ideas that I, as a tech, someone young, and B, someone tech focused who grew up with technology, my instinct is that that's our greatest means of organizing, and like he says, of an event like George Floyd can be propagated across the world, and events can happen and be organized in a few days with the right spark. So as fatalistic as the precarity looks, on the one hand, so too is that precarity subject to positive social change, which is a really good countenance to fatalism in my eyes. But anyway, digital means as a common.
In a much more simple way, John, it's just a business. Do you feel a business, like if we separated the internet into people who just collect personal data and set that up as a separate business, and then the other part would be a communication medium that would be governed by the people of America?
So this is pretty much what I'm studying in school, and what I'm studying in my free time, even to try to answer that question.
Well, you could answer it to me right now. Should we?
Should we? Should
Monopolistic. I'd just like to finish, John.
Sorry.
Split this gargantuan business into two parts. One would be a business that 24 hours a day collects personal data.
So in
Yeah.
my
Please, John, please. The
Go
other,
ahead, I'm sorry.
I'm asking you, would simply be a communications medium that would be, as Georgia mentioned, would go back to being governed by the FTC. How do you feel about breaking up that business into those two parts?
So I would say, the internet shouldn't be a business in the first place. In this day and age, it's
No,
like what?
Question, if it had to be broken down into one business would just collect personal data every time you blow your nose. Every
So
time.
let me,
I
And
think John did answer it, Rocky.
right. So so A, it shouldn't be a business, and B, I would say that we should become owners of our data again. That's the goal.
On it.
Okay, let's not get off on this right now. Jeremy just entered the room.
So
Jeremy, are you there? I see your picture, but not you live.
I will answer that, Rocky, at some point.
There you are, Jeremy. Great. Welcome. We are recording because we thought this would be an important enough discussion that we wanted to have it on record. And we've kind of been looking at some of the ideas in your book. I had suggested going chapter by chapter, but was kind of shot down because they said it would take too long, which it would. But part of me would love to do that because I feel like it needs that focus. But instead, we've kind of been all over the map. And I want to ask you before we get going, would you have a preference of how we approach the discussion with you?
Oh, not really. I guess one possible approach, if we wanted to look at some structure but not get stuck in the chapter thing, is to look at the sections. Those key questions. Who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? Why am I? And where are we going? So there's 6 sections. So it's still a little bit. It might be overly structured in terms of where the conversation goes, but at least it gives a little bit more leeway. So it's just a thought.
Yes, we can do that. It's interesting that those questions weren't where I focused. I focused on the chapter heads.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just like my mind didn't go there because they seem so general that I zeroed in on the actual chapter titles. And I don't know if anyone else had the same experience or not.
Absolutely. And, perhaps another completely different way to go would be, I'm not sure how you often do these kind of discussions, but it might be kind of nice for each person to just sort of kick off with the thing that struck them the most, or like that they take away the strongest, or like what is, if somebody asked them what's the book about and they wanted to give their sense of this is the biggest takeaway, this is what it is in my mind. So that might be a nice way to feel into how people are really feeling strongest, and then see where that leads us.
I think that's a good idea, Jeremy. Would someone like to begin with what their main idea that they want to put out there for either to discuss with Jeremy or what they want his input on? What impressed you the most? Go ahead, Rocky.
I would love to. Good to see you again, Jeremy. I am incredibly impressed with the way you organized the book, with your scholarship, and just your general knowledge of anthropology going back tens of thousands of years, and right up to this very date, and especially to divide it into really 5 philosophical and sociological areas. It was very powerful listening to the way you could answer each one of those. My question is, at 10 years from now, where will we be? This is a great book. This could influence a lot of people, Jeremy.
Well, yeah, I mean, thanks for that. And that is really my hope for the book, honestly. I mean, I don't want to sound too aggrandizing or whatever, but I really want to put the book and these ideas out there as like this possible foundation for truly like this different worldview that could actually lead our whole civilization into a different direction. Yeah, and I think, one point about that, just from my own perspective, is I'm not trying to put these ideas out as, oh, these are my ideas. Here's another white male coming up, with this, like, oh, I've got the solution to, because it's really not about me or my ideas. That's why very much it is this kind of weaving in a way. It's all the ideas of so many other like modern scientists and thinkers out there, indigenous thinkers, and then the traditional ideas. And all I'm really trying to do is weave something together to say, this is what our general human heritage is. And all we need to do is to use that as a framework. So I guess the idea about it is that hopefully it's a framework for people to build on rather than something to shut in conversation or ideas, but I said to open up just ways of thinking about how our interconnectedness relates not just it to one domain, but so many domains interconnecting with each other. So that's my deep hope for the book. The thing is, to me, the big question is, will mainstream thinkers be ready to even start looking at this? I tried to structure the book actually so that it wouldn't turn off like somebody who's more like an Uncle Bob type person, but some open-minded, they wouldn't turn them off right away. I tried to sort of lead into some of the bigger, more radical ways of shifting our ways of thinking towards later in the book so that people could build step by step. So when they came to the bigger shifts, it became a little kind of, well, obviously, rather than feeling that they're being hit over the head.
One of the areas you brought up, Jeremy, that we were discussing a little bit before you came on the call, and I think it's really important if people can grasp this concept to be open to the rest of what you're saying, is the fact that science has embraced this reductionist way of seeing the world so that everything is approached from that lens, whether it's geoengineering, which comes right out of reductionist thinking, and to be able to point that out, I think is really important. And it's not necessarily a way we've thought about talking to other people or writing about, but to frame this kind of thinking in a very particular reductionist way of looking at the world, and then show that there's a better way to look at the world, the way the world actually works.
Right.
So
yes, I agree with you, Georgia. And I think a key point that I keep trying to come back to again and again whenever we talk on this particular topic is to point out this distinction between science and reductionism, because so many people are in that place of just thinking that science does mean that reductionist thinking. And so if there's an attack on reductionism, they take that as being an attack on science, and they, but so what about all the good things and all this kind of stuff. And so to me, this is a critical thing to say that science, actually this ontological reductionism is not scientific. It's actually more like a religious leap of faith. And science, and sort of the whole notion is that we can embrace science without embracing reductionism. And again, not excluding reductionism, like recognizing the incredible positive element, what reductionist thinking has brought to our world, and recognizing that it's just one aspect that we can then build on rather than it being the be all and end all. So something I just kind of wanted to share actually is maybe interesting around this is just yesterday afternoon, I was with some family, my sister and her husband is a retired doctor, and they have kids. Two of them are in their 20s or 30s, and they're programmers in Silicon Valley, and really open-minded, good-hearted liberal thinkers, but very much coming from this scientific reductionist point of view. It was wonderful to hear this 30-year-old sort of young programmer saying, I'm so glad. I've always thought I had to choose between what I believe is science. My friends are all atheists, believing in science and algorithms and technology. And I always thought I had to choose between that and spirituality. And now he's just reading the book right now and going, I see maybe I don't have to make that choice. Maybe it can all be incorporated. So that gave me some encouraging feelings as to how people might relate.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting point. Does someone else go ahead?
Yeah. On that note, I'd like to go next, given I'm a 20-something programmer, so who's also found a lot of joy and knowledge and stuff in the book. I'm definitely reading it again as soon as, starting reading it again right after this. But anyway, you mentioned over and over the connectedness and the, perhaps the infrastructure to connect people as such an integral part of change and in our way of thinking and all of life. So I guess my question is, how powerful, what are the limits of the internet, that we should, that us techies should watch out for? Because in my eyes, seize back the internet, make it a peer-to-peer system where no more corporations, no more profit models take data ownership back of the individual. And that provides the power that these algorithmic influencers like Google and Facebook use to derive influence. That's how we take that back, is we, get the data control back and
Right.
that type of stuff. So
Yeah, I love your question, John. I actually feel in many ways that thing you just described, that notion of taking back the internet for people is maybe one of the most important things that can be done in the next 10 to 20 years or whatever to truly transform our society. I think the power of the internet is beyond even our abilities to even imagine. I mean, it may be assuming humanity has a long-term future of civilization, which is a big assumption. But if that's the case, we may look back at this time of the rise of the internet as being as important as maybe even the rise of language or certainly as or more important than the emergence of writing in transforming human civilization and culture. It's so vast just because we're just really looking at the very beginnings of what's actually possible with that connectivity. But as long as it's owned by these gigantic corporations, it's turned into this powerful instrument for toxic devastation of human well-being, just like I describe a little bit in the book, but of course there's books that go into it in far more detail, is how these technologists are using these powers to go deep into our hormonal structures of our being and, control and manipulate those dopamine hits and all that stuff to the point where we literally become zombies to some degree at the behest of profit making for Facebook and Google and the rest of them. And so the commons-based, to my mind, any approach that tries to take back the internet, the first thing it has to do is not structure itself as a for-profit company. I don't know if you're familiar with this book by Anand Giridharadas, Winners Take All. Such a great book. And this whole concept of doing well by doing good, and this mythical, alluring fiction that leads people down this path of ending up making this destructive framework we're in even more destructive because it looks a bit better. And so as any for-profit structure inevitably, structurally will get transformed by the capitalist model into something that is toxic and poisonous. So starting with something that's either cooperative or commons-based as the very structure, but then looking at ways, how can we bring advertising dollars in and give it back to the people who are using it? What kind of model is there for ownership of like a Facebook type network to actually accrue to everybody who uses it, so that it's democratic, so it's really fully distributed, and decision-making and the profits arising from it actually get distributed in that way? I think these are some of the most radical and positive, hopeful approaches we can take.
Hey, who would like to, Linda?
Well, I loved your book because it was such a great synthesis of so much that I've been just trying to myself synthesize around West versus Eastern thought, how the brain works, for instance. I thought you did a great job with that. I've been involved for many years. Much of my career was something called Bohm Dialogue. I don't know if you know the work of David Bohm. You probably do.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a little bit surprised at the end that you don't have a lot of collective practices that you recommend, because really it's the changing of our consciousness that's going to be the final solution. Well, there's no final solution, but so many of the problems that you point out come from the fact that we've consciously made bad choices as a human species. So to take those bad choices back means we've got to change our consciousness, but we don't really have the time. I mean, I can sit in dialogue for, the rest of my life, but that's not probably going to change society unless we could all be in dialogue, but that's not going to happen either. So what is the way? We've got like 9 years, according to the IPPCA, to the IP, what is it? The II, you know what I'm talking about.
Right, IPCC.
I never can get it right.
Right.
So what's the speediest way we can start to work at that collective level from your point of view?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I wish I had the answer, but of course, none of us has the answer. And I think that really that kind of is part of it, really, is just realizing I sort of look at this process of transformation that's needed a little bit like sort of Indra's web, like that I described towards the end of the book, or just thinking of it as a very, very complex adaptive system, like this kind of moving web. And I think the point about that is if we look at the system's change, not just the system itself, but the transformation in that way, we realize that there's not one simple answer. I take a lot, myself, I take a lot of inspiration from Metcalfe's law, which is this mathematical description of how networks work, which is that the power of a network is a function of the square of the connections in that network, meaning the more connectivity there is, the power of that network exponentially increases. But here's the point about it, is that this is not just any network. This is a network where every one of our connections, we think of the connections as being each of us talking to each other, like millions and millions of conversations happening every moment, every day around the world. That transformation only works when the majority of those connections lead to an amplification of the transformation that's needed rather than a deadening of the transformation that's needed. So it's not just the connection itself, it's the quality of the connection. And to me, what I take away from that is how important it is to focus each of our attentions on the work that others are doing around us that we can amplify. That it's not enough just to say, this is what I care about, and I'm going to do every bit that I can to make that as effective as possible and try to get others to buy into it and go with it. But to look around and say, what's somebody else doing that could be where I could add a little bit of value, not necessarily saying reinvest all my time in that, but how can I add a little bit to amplify that, and a little bit to amplify that? And as more people do that, the whole network suddenly wakes up. Because the only thing that's going to save us, in my view, is the phase transition, like the whole thing waking up a little bit like a mycorrhizal fungal network, like the things are happening right now, but they're mostly below ground. But I think as things begin to unravel more, there's this potential for things to just take off, and just the same way the George Floyd's murder led to this like unbelievable effect around the world, or Greta Thunberg. We don't know what the catalysts are or who the people are who are going to lead to these catalysts, but we can each do our part by trying to amplify that network to the extent that we can.
Yeah, but that brings up something else that you mentioned, Jeremy, in the book about we have to really put aside the idea of the hero, that we're going to be the individual who comes in and does all the work that's going to save the planet or save our area. That notion of heroism and celebrity is so much a part of our culture.
Yeah.
That and you very well point out the problem with it, that we have to be part of the network, part of the community, rather than the self that becomes the celebrity. So I thought that was a really interesting point, which I'm going to go to Jeffrey, because you mentioned something about the individual versus society. So you want to talk about that? No, maybe you're not ready.
Yeah. No, let me pass on that for a minute.
Okay, I noticed that your sound is a little bit down, so you're going to need to put your sound up. Do you want me to go to someone else first?
Yes.
Okay, Matt or Kathleen or Rocky, or actually Matt or Kathleen, you're the two that haven't talked yet.
Well, so I didn't read the book, so I'm just listening. So I don't have much to say.
Okay, Kathleen, you have anything you want to?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a specific question, because I think I probably have to reread it to even begin to understand it. But what I found interesting just in my own personal stuff is how what you're saying, I'm actually hearing in other places. So I think there was a part in Premonition, Michael Lewis's book, about a doctor at UCSF, and he went a different way at looking at things than reduction. And so rather trying to figure out what doesn't work, he went another way. So just like little tidbits. I mean, I sort of love this in life, because you start seeing it more and more, and maybe other people. And then of course I'm really interested in the nature part, because I have a feeling nature is going to be our teacher in the future. I think that's going to be our boss that we're all going to sign up and deal with. And did you ever read, Alexander von Humboldt?
Mhm.
There's a book out called The Invention of Nature, and he talked about the interconnectedness of everything. And he was friends with Jefferson, and the whole, like, this stuff has been, people have gotten this, well, you did a whole history of the way that, but even in modern time, people have said, we're all connected, the ant, the Congo, the this, the minute you start, and yet we went full forward, and here we are.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think it's interesting that von Humboldt, in his time in the middle of the 19th century, was one of the sort of leading figures. He was a uber celebrity, and then now he's forgotten. It's like that biography of his was one of the first books that helped to bring him a little bit of awareness in the modern world. But
well, Darwin loved him. Darwin
Right.
got his whole The Beagle and the Voyager because of von Humboldt.
Right.
Yeah, and nobody knows him.
Exactly.
It's like,
no one knows von Humboldt's name. Everyone knows Darwin's name. And
Yeah.
I think it just speaks to, I mean, I call it, in the patterning instinct, I describe it in more detail, and I refer to it more in footnotes in the Web of Meaning, but I call that like the moonlight tradition in Western thought, because it can be traced all the way back to Heraclitus, way back pre-Socratic area, who was the one who talked about, like wisdom is to look at the interconnections between all things, and you can't step into the same river twice because everything's always moving. And Aristotle and Leonardo da Vinci and Goethe. I mean, there's been this wonderful tradition in the West looking at this connectivity. But the reason I call it the moonlight tradition is because you don't even see it, because it's like the sun is the mainstream tradition of reductionism, totally wipes it out. So you have to sort of eclipse the sun, and then you see this beautiful other tradition that's been there all along, but is kind of invisible to the naked eye, if you will. And that's part of the reason why I focus most of my book not so much on that tradition, but on the East Asian traditions, mostly in like Buddhism and Neo-Confucianism and Taoism, because there, that sense of connectedness was the sunlight's tradition. That was the mainstream tradition that led the great thinkers from generation to the next to develop further ideas, ways of living in a connected universe. Whereas in the West, people were talking about how do you live in a dualistic universe. And that's why I think there's so much we can learn from that, not to glorify some Orientalist version of, the romantic East, but because there was tons of, great wisdom evolving over generations that we can embrace and we can use into the future.
And I just want to ask you, because these ideas, I feel like you're on to something that a lot of, are people, well, your nephews, the programmers, are people being receptive to these ideas that we're mostly all like Uncle Bob or whatever,
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, for the most part, the book, so far, it's just been out, obviously, for a couple of months. And it's so far received tremendously positive response from people who are already awakened to some aspect of our connectedness, people who are already activists or people who are already in transformative work in one way or another. And they read this book and they go, great, this is putting all the pieces together. A lot of the time people say, the book seems to me, not to denigrate it, but it's saying stuff that I feel like I've known all my life, but it's actually putting words around it. And it feels like a big yes. And so I'm getting very positive response from the people who are a really key audience for the book, because many people are working on one transformative segment, but are not necessarily aware of how similar work of looking at the implications of interconnectedness are going on in very different areas. Some people might be in politics, some people might be in environmental activism, some people might be in spiritual work, some people might be in science, and they're not necessarily aware of how much this is all part of a bigger paradigm shift. So hopefully it's doing positive in that regard. I think it's going to take a while before the real armchair Uncle Bobs actually bother to even look at the book, to do something about it. I'll give you an interesting example. There's somebody one or two of you may have heard of. His name is Marcelo Gleiser. He's a physicist, and he's got a little bit of a well-known name. He's written a couple of sort of best-selling books, kind of explaining physics or like physics concepts to more mainstream world. And he does work. There's a NPR sort of podcast called 13/7, which is about sort of big picture thinking and a lot about with connectedness. So I was really hoping that he reviews books of a similar ilk. And I said, yeah, that might be the way into the mainstream for him to look at the book. And he was interested in the book enough to ask the publicist to send him a copy. So I was really excited, like I was going, he's got to love this book. And then a couple of weeks later, when the publicist followed up with him, he said, no, I've decided I don't want to review the book. And we were really disappointed. And I've tried to figure out why, because it's certainly, I mean, I'm sure it's not because he didn't feel the scientific rigor was there, because it is there and he would have recognized that. And I have a feeling it's because he got uncomfortable, because it pushes outside of his comfort zone, because he tends to write these articles just going to the edge of the zone of mainstream thinking and putting little questions out. Is it possible we should rethink how science is versus values or whatever? And I sort of go into this whole other domain, and I get a little bit, I get quite almost like polemical about it. I say our civilization is destructive and we've got to, so I sort of get people involved in engagement. And I have a feeling that somewhere along the line, he went, I don't want to get involved with this person who's making too many of these steps. So I just better, it's safer if I just don't have anything to do with this book. So I feel, I mean, that to me is the critical point. Like, when will people who are in the mainstream feel more ready to like be open to some of these ideas? Only time will tell, basically.
Well, the other thing is the mainstream doesn't necessarily need to wake up as fast as a whole other group of people. Because when we talk about critical mass, which is really what we need to make major change, it might even eclipse most of the mainstream. It might just be kind of on the edges, or like Tom Hayden used to say, they're on the margins, but then they start moving into the mainstream where people aren't even realizing that's happening.
Yes.
And, so that's possible.
I think you're right, Georgia. And I think what is key is the younger generation. I tell you, I get, I mean, of course, I love having these conversations with everybody of every age, because each one has its own value. But when I talk to people in their 20s or early 30s, who are actually, especially people who are doing their own podcasts and are engaged in transformative thinking, and get a sense from them that this is really helping to transform their ways of thinking, that gets me so excited, because I just imagine decades of their life of what they can be doing, moving the next generation to a different place.
Okay, Jeffrey, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the question of the transformation. I mean, I'm interested in the mechanism that you think would be critical, and I can't help but think that the crises that are coming or have already started, such as the climate crisis, the crisis of COVID, these are going to be the real transformative elements, because they are going to force this critical mass to move, to transform the thinking. I just don't see that the individual, again, it's this individual versus the collective, I don't see that the individual ideas are going to have that much influence. I think the critical mass is going to have to come from the crises.
Yes, I agree with you. And I think those two elements actually work very synergistically together. There's this quote from Milton Friedman that Naomi Klein quotes it, and it goes something like when he's talking about sort of putting out these neoliberal ideas as part of the Montpellier Society like decades ago, and he says something like, we got to lay the groundwork for these ideas, because when the crises hit, it's the ideas that are lying around that people then pick up and use to move into the next phase. And this will obviously work. Like, people in the Montpellier Society got started in the late 40s, and through the 50s and 60s and 70s for decades. You could have looked at all the work they were doing with writing their papers and treatises and ideas as being utterly irrelevant. They had virtually no impact on society. And then the crises hit in the late 70s, the stagflation and all that stuff. And suddenly these ideas that had been lying kind of fallow for decades, but they had been seeding their people through all the different institutions, power institutions around the world. And then this transformation happened within a few years. Neoliberal ideology took over the world, essentially. And I see something similar, that I agree strongly that this whole system is only going to change as a result of its unraveling. I sort of think of it often like a tightly knit basket, if you will, which if you try to sort of just take your hands and tear this, or maybe a rug might be a better example. If you try to tear it with your hands, nothing's going to happen because it's too tightly knit. But imagine that rug starting to unravel and get moth-eaten, and all the weaves just become looser and looser, which is essentially what's happening as the structural the ways in which society doesn't make sense causes that unraveling to take place. So as that happens, it's more possible to reweave those loose strands into something different. But ultimately, what is so terrifying and really like makes the odds so dauntingly difficult is that none of us wants this current society to totally collapse. I mean, and it is very unstable. Just to the point of, the idea that in cities, like, starvation is always just no more than a few days away because of the just-in-time inventory of food getting into supermarkets, all that kind of stuff. We do live in a very unstable civilization. A collapse would be utter disaster for everybody. And that's something that is to be avoided at all costs. But somehow what we need to do is, as things begin to unravel, but before it actually collapses, reweave the more transformative connected system within the system of the old. That is the incredible, difficult project, really, that's available to us. That kid's game of cat's cradle, where you take the string and you sort of, you have it in a certain pattern, and then suddenly you move your hand and a whole different pattern just emerges. That's essentially what we need to do to offer humanity the future we need. But that's why I think the ideas that, especially people in the older generation, the ideas that we put out there are so essential, not because we think they're going to make the change in the next 5 years or the next 10 years, but because that next generation then can turn to those ideas to find really a fully formed alternative way of rethinking society that's available to them.
Well, that's very inspiring, actually. I mean, to realize that these ideas could be the ones lying around
right
when this crisis really hits. And we're kind of at that place. I mean, part of what you mentioned in your book reminded me of Strauss and Howe, the fourth turning, where they see, I think they would describe we are on the unraveling stage. And then there's that next putting it all together, like you were just talking about.
Yeah.
In some ways it seems overwhelming, and in other ways it's putting these pieces together kind of step by step and understanding what we need in the world.
So if I could ask, what are the place of, what place the leaders have in a world where, like you say, we need to start thinking globally, but we also need to stop relying on central, governments or corporations or whatever powers that are corruptible. I guess just what place do leaders have versus decentralization in this world? And then B, I don't know, are you familiar with the cypherpunk, manifesto and those ideas that at all, cypherpunks?
I've come across the concept, but I'd be hard put to put more than a sentence or two around it. So I'd love to hear your own explanation of that. I'd be very interested, because it does look interesting to me. So maybe, do you want to talk more about that, or do you want me to talk about that leadership question first, and then?
Yeah, let's do leadership, and then we'll talk.
Yeah,
about
sure.
cypherpunk.
I'd love to hear more from you on that. I think this question of leadership, and I know, Georgia, I think you just had a whole conversation on it, and I'd love to hear what came out of that. So I can say my 2 cents on that first, and then maybe, Georgia, we can turn to you or whoever else was in that group, so you can summarize what arose in your own meeting on that. But my view is very much the role for leaders in this kind of place of transformation is very much, well, partly to kind of lead from behind, if you will, and to avoid this risk of this kind of Elon Musk style hero type thing, like, oh, I'm the one who has got the answer, like, follow me. And to the extent that happens, and it has to happen, because so even like somebody like a Greta Thunberg, who is the last person you would have looked at and said, oh, that's going to be a leader. But people want leadership. They love to sort of get behind an individual and say, yes, she's the one, she's going to lead us to this place. And to anyone who finds themselves in that place, I think the biggest work that needs to be done is the inner work, the work of continually trying to unravel the sort of ego gratification from the true sense of a calling, a true sense of letting life speak through you. And I think that's always ongoing work, because, it's like in all the great mythical stories, whether it's the great, the great stories of the past, or even something like Lord of the Rings or whatever, where as soon as you get to hold onto the ring, it takes you over, your ego gets massively inflated and you go, the power, I can do so much by, I must be the best. And so I think the real critical role in leadership is to do that inner work, not necessarily step down from a role of leadership if people are looking to you to help drive something, but to keep discerning what is it that is being driven by really the way in which I, or whoever is that leader, is a vessel for life, for like what's needed for transforming, and watching to make sure that the ego doesn't start to take over from that place. And that's difficult. And that's where I think it's best for leadership to be very distributed. And it's best for most of the leaders to be non-white males, quite honestly, because so much of the last couple of millennia have been driven by the patriarchy. And it's just too easy for people in that, who have white skin and come from the global north and are males to find themselves in positions of privilege and take advantage of that unconsciously without even realizing. So the more the leadership comes from people with other colored skins and people who are women, that's going to help to establish the transformation that we need. I'm not saying that always has to be the case, but that will help to move into that different way of thinking that has to essentially decolonize our collective mind.
Can I just jump in on that with our leadership ideas for the day?
I'd love to
before
hear.
we go on to the next part. One thing, I don't know that we brought it up that day, but I think everybody knew it on the call, is when you're talking about women in leadership, when you look at countries like Scandinavia, where they mandated that a certain percentage, 40 to 50% of the parliament has to be made up of women, you see that the focus of the country is very different than when that's not the case. And the social programs are front and center in those countries. Mm-hmm. And I think, even in the Basque region, which has its own parliament, they had I think it was, I don't know, small percentage of women who were in their parliament, and now it's almost close to 50. So, I mean, that's changed in a very short amount of time when they started understanding, being educated and understanding. And they don't look at leadership in the way we do in America. It's not a self-aggrandizing kind of position.
Mhm.
It's one that you earn through a certain kind of either training or education or accomplishment, but it has nothing to do with stroking egos.
Mhm.
It's mostly managing. It's really
Right.
a managerial position rather than a celebrity position.
Right.
And understanding that difference is hard in our culture. And we
Yeah.
did talk about that. That cultures that don't have this need, and they're very few, for a celebrity type of leader, how we get out of that almost childlike need, because it
Mhm.
is childish in a way,
Yes.
where
Yeah.
we need someone who's going to tell us what to do, or there's something very immature about that need. And I'm wondering if also if you could address that need and how we might look at that or talk about it.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think ultimately it does, I think, come a lot back to this notion of identity. I mean, one of the things that I sort of realized, I discovered it more as I was writing the book rather than understanding this going into the writing of the book, but is how so much of our values and how we live our lives arises from our sense of identity. And to the extent that our identity is mostly with the group of which we're connected, and that group can be our community, all of humanity, all of life, and maybe fractally, maybe sort of shifting dynamically between each of those layers. But to the extent that our identity is there in those places, there is less danger of that stroking of the ego, because that's what we want, is for those kind of stronger layers to be strengthened. And I guess what we're doing for ourselves, how we're perceived individually, is less important. And I think that there was something interesting, I thought, in just fairly recently, my partner and I watched that Disney movie, of all things, Moana. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's this beautiful film set in some sort of island paradise kind of Hawaiian style thing. But it's about a girl hero. It's like the hero's journey, but it's from the point of view of this girl. Her name is Moana, who and she's the one who has to sort of go brave the oceans, and she lives in this little patriarchal culture in her little village. But she ends up with this incredibly courageous and goes and slays the dragon, but actually slays only through love, because the dragon turns out to be transformed from a loving person, all this kind of stuff. But the whole thing is driven by her desire to save her community, which is undergoing this poison of a plague. And so it's not about her going like, oh, I want to be this great queen, but I need to save my community. I've got to do this for my community. And I think that's because in the whole sort of setting was like her identity was with the community. And there's one of the people I quote in my book is an indigeneity scholar, LaDonna Harris, Native American scholar, who talks about these four R's of indigeneity, things like relationship, respect, reciprocity, redistribution. And her point is, people ask her when she talks about them, they say, well, doesn't somebody lose their sense of their individuality by always focusing on this group community stuff? And she said, on the contrary, your sense of who you are as a person becomes stronger when you define yourself in relation to the community rather than separate from it. It doesn't subsume your true identity, it actually enlarges it. And so I think that it's when we truly identify with those other layers, that those issues of the corruption, if you will, of celebrity and power go away. But since we're born into this individualized civilization, and so many of us are acculturated in that way, I do think it takes inner work, whatever each of us has available, like meditation or other practices, to become aware, to actually work intentionally on expanding our identity to those other layers. I mean, I know for me, it's a continual work in progress, something I take very seriously, but it doesn't feel like it's a done thing. It's always there in progress,
It's
basically.
in flux,
Yeah, definitely.
as Clyda says.
I have a comment on that because I've been talking
Yeah.
to so many people, young and old, that are having more problems in 2021 than 2020. Because in 2020, they felt a purpose, like I've got to stay home, I've got to do this. And in 2021, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Everything is just kind of going, you can do this, maybe you can do that, and then you can become yourself, you can travel. Where 2020, they really felt like, like I found myself calling my neighbor, I'm going to the store, do you want something? I don't call her anymore. She's on her, so maybe if we could tap into what we all did, even the non-vaxxers did it, it was a sense of the whole.
It's true. Yeah, so much of that mutual aid, that community-based mutual aid was so powerful and enlivening. And like you say, it's kind of gotten dissolved somehow in the last year, in the last few months, hasn't it?
I resurrected it by getting this.
Yeah.
So now people are doing things for me and being really nice, keeping it
But
alive.
I think people like that, and you write that in your book, that actually people do want to be part of the whole. I think it's sort of sad that that's difficult to get to when it serves us.
I know, it's true. Rebecca Solnit wrote this book, A Paradise, I think it was called A Paradise Built in Hell. She went, to the places where things were catastrophic, like New Orleans after the original hurricane there, Katrina, and there's other places like New York after its disasters. And in each place, and San Francisco after the earthquake, when disasters happen, people, rather than this Hobbesian idea of everyone's out for themselves and they go looting the stores, the exact opposite takes place. The vast majority of people are spending their time doing heroic stuff, looking out for others around them. And they just feel this is the need. And there was this global version of that when COVID first hit. So the question comes, why doesn't that happen all the time? And I think it's largely because our global civilization is built on this culture of this cult of the individual and this culture of capitalism, which, tells us that we're meant to look out for number one, and this is where I sort of use Uncle Bob as the foil towards the end of the book, where I have Uncle Bob says, well, okay, I get everything you're saying in this book so far, but I still got to look out for number one. And my sort of answer to Uncle Bob in that is not to try to tell him, no, you're wrong in doing that. But this recognition, to me, is a very powerful concept of this Chinese concept of what they call Ren, which is this sort of sense of deep loving kindness of all, like this recognition of sharing with all humanity, and this recognition that you are just one with the universe and with all of life, and all living beings are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. And that deep recognition of Ren is the thing that leads your identity to expand out there. And what I find so fascinating is that in Chinese, the word for numbness is basically non-Ren, like Bu Ren is the word for numbness. So it's as if it's such a powerful metaphor, if you will, because it's like, we know when our skin feels normal, if I touch my hands together, the skin, the fingers know the other fingers right there. But if I'm numb, I can put those together and I'm not aware that I'm actually connecting with something else, right? I just feel like I'm completely in isolation. And so that Bu Ren, that numbness, is essentially the condition of our individualized society that numbs us to the reality of our deep interconnectedness. And so I feel all we can do about that is to live in our own lives according to that deep connectedness, and just invite, explicitly but implicitly invite other people around us to wake up to that.
If I could just build on that a little bit, when I listen to this whole conversation we're having and thinking about how we almost are seeing in front of us right now the unraveling of society, and we almost have to have society unravel before we can step out of this radical individualism, which is keeping your, your uncle, whatever,
You're right, Uncle Bob.
Bob, in line or in check. What do you think about just falling back on? I mean, I guess how I'm beginning to see it is if society itself starts to break down, we will start to find ourselves in smaller communities, and we will start to be able to have opportunities to help each other because that's what we do. And then I think about indigenous societies. I mean, who was the guy? There was a guy that wrote a book called Original Politics, Glenn somebody, I can't remember his last name right now, but even the United States Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, some of our early people who put the Constitution together took from the Iroquois some of our founding ways of our democracy. So it's not like some of these ideas of indigenous society are completely foreign to us. So maybe that's what's going to happen. We have to kind of break down, and then we'll find these ideas sort of, as you said, there'll be some other people working maybe in these other networks where the new generation will go to for the ideas, and maybe some of them will be indigenous ones. I mean, they had it pretty well down about how life is all connected and how to take care of nature. I mean, that's what we need to go back to.
Yes, I agree. In terms of when I find myself talking about these similar things, I oftentimes try to avoid using the phrase "go back to," because there are so many people out there who have this knee-jerk response that we can't go back. We've got 8 billion people in the world right now, and there's no golden age. And if you look, but I completely agree with you. But the only way that I would add or rephrase that a little bit is that we need to move forward with the help of all the wisdom, the accumulated wisdom of all of humanity. And the indigenous wisdom is this core foundational wisdom that's everywhere, all around the world, in every continent. There are people who still maintain some of that knowledge and some of that ways of thinking. So that's where, I imagine number of you are familiar with people like Robin Wall Kimmerer, of course, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, which is this great book of indigenous knowledge. She's a indigenous Native American. She's also a biologist. And so she weaves together that knowledge foundation in that scientific framework really well. Another person is Tyson Yunkaporta from Australia, who's an Aboriginal who wrote this book, Sand Talk, that I'd strongly recommend you consider for your book club, actually, who again weaves together systems thinking with deep Aboriginal wisdom, and does it in a beautiful way, just bringing a whole different style of relating and being to sort of think about modern world issues. But yeah, I think those are the people who are really helping us to find our way forward.
Sorry, what was that second book again? Braiding Sweetgrass
and the second one is called Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta. I can put it in the chat.
Yeah, we put it in the chat and then we save it. I wanted to bring up something that I don't want to get lost, and then we'll go to John, back to John. But you mentioned in the book about mystical experiences and some of the drug-induced experiences that people have that kind of expand one's consciousness. And then you made it a point, which I think is really interesting, that infants have this also. That infants have this sense of oneness and see or experience reality in a different way. As we grow up, all of this is systematically shut down. And I certainly am one of these people who remember way back into my childhood and remember systematically how all this was shut down. And how sad on some level I was, but knowing that, okay, to fit in, I got to do this. To fit in, I've got to stop talking about this. I've got to stop believing this. I mean, it was just a literal shutting down layer by layer to the point where I became a reductionist. Because that seemed like that's reality. And of course, I've come back from that. But that process, I think, is so important for people to understand that children don't have this reductionist sense of the world and how it's shut down with them, and what we might be able to do to help people understand that that isn't the way we always were. And if you have
Yes.
any comments on that.
Anybody else got any?
Maybe that was out of
Yeah.
left field, but I just.
No,
thought it
no,
was-
no. I think you're right. I think, I mean, one of the things I touch on, I don't go into sort of detail about it, but is looking at the different pathways available to us once we are grown-ups, kind of thing, to reconnect with that.
Mhm.
And in my view, definitely psychedelics, or we could call it medicine, sacred medicine, if another term maybe makes more sense, is a wonderful approach if approached with deep intentionality and along with a guide, because oftentimes those approaches, they don't necessarily lead to that sense of interconnectedness and oneness. I mean, they can lead to reaffirm very different worldviews too. So it's not like that's a panacea, but it does help to break down barriers and lead to the possibility of that reconnecting. And we've talked about indigenous peoples as a place to gain inspiration, but that's very important for us as for people who come from the sort of white global north, not to take advantage of that, not to be exploitative in ways in which we relate to that. And that is a key, to really honor that and to make sure that anytime we are gaining from that kind of wisdom, to make sure that we're giving back as hopefully much more even than we're gaining in terms of whatever resources we have, whether it's financial or giving platforms to people or supporting politically or whatever it might be. But then there's just connecting with nature, just really going into that place, not just sort of going for a walk in the state park or whatever, but really feeling that deep connection with all of our relatives around us. And doing all of these things with others intentionally in groups is key, because that's a whole element, of course, of our interconnectedness, is that group layer. And I think there are spiritual paths that are available, but in almost every one of these ways, there are kind of false paths which can lead people to feel, oh yeah, I'm really growing, I'm really shedding these layers of conditioning, but they can often lead to that sort of Me Too generation, like the kind of me generation type sort of concept, the sense of, I need to fulfill my own path, fulfill my own self. And it can go very much back into that individualist perspective. So it's so key to really be asking ourselves some of these core questions at all times, like, how am I connecting with all of life around me? What am I doing that is in the really interest of life, basically?
I think John wants to ask something.
Yeah, so I just wanted to go back to the idea of cypherpunks and how it relates to the
Right.
digital commons
Right.
that
That's gonna ask, yeah.
because at first I would like to say a brief one-liner description is like the church of the digital commons. That's how I would describe the cypherpunk movement. Basically, they say we're in a digital world, everything is digital. Privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. We cannot expect governments, corporations, or other large faceless organizations to grant us privacy. We must defend our own privacy if we expect to have any. This is from the first publication of the, after the manifesto that cemented this movement. This is just a brief one paragraph little. The people in this room hope for a world where an individual's informational footprints, everything from an opinion on abortion to the medical record of an actual abortion, can be traced only if the individual chooses to reveal them. A world where coherent messages shoot around the globe by network and microwave, but intruders and feds trying to pluck them out of the vapor find only gibberish. A world where the tools of the prying are transformed into the instruments of privacy. There is only one way this vision will materialize, and that is by the widespread use of cryptography. Is this technologically possible? Definitely. The obstacles are political. Some of the most powerful forces in government are devoted to.
Oh, you got muted, John.
Gotcha. Sorry. So basically, yeah. How early in that paragraph did I get cut out?
You used a word, I didn't hear it, cartography or something. It would
Yeah,
only,
cryptography, the idea that securing information between Alice and Bob, two parties, the way, how do you secure that information such that no one can interpret it? So a third party can't read it. The medium of travel, someone in the middle can't read your message, they can't, see what you're sending to your friend.
you're saying that, and you're saying in the psychopunk, is it psychopunk or pump?
Cipher, like a cipher, a way to encode information.
Also,
CS
not cyberpunk, it's cypherpunk, you're saying.
Cypherpunk.
Right, cipher, SCYPHER.
You want to write it down in the chat box, John?
Yeah, I'll link to, but basically it's the recognition that we're in a digital world and privacy is not going to come from laws or corporations or anyone. It's only going to come from a digital commons, an open source implementation of an internet of communication protocols, of payment protocols, and all of that is going to come not from a centralized government or a corporation or anything. That's going to come from open source code. And that's the digital commons that you referred to near the end of the book. And I want to, you mentioned again, that's why I asked you, the first question I asked was about the digital commons and the limits of an internet, because how do I reconcile my feeling that that's the solution to everything, and that fallacy you mentioned that tech is the answer to everything? I don't know how to reconcile those two parts of me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's that thing about the kind of fallacy that tech is the solution to everything is hugely important. And it relates to something a little different. It relates more to this notion of, we have a problem, a global problem, a systems problem. Let's find a technical solution. We have a problem with climate change. Let's come up with geoengineering, or even the solution is lots and lots of renewables or solar panels or whatever. And so it's when tech is masquerading basically as just another inroad of global capitalism in response to a problem, rather than recognizing the systemic underlying problems that need to be transformed. But having said that, I mean, assuming our global civilization has a long-term future, that future is going to be very much based on the internet and on that technological connectedness. And so I do feel that there's almost, I mean, one of the most important things to be working on right now is to really reclaim that new medium of human communication from these global corporate hubs that have now begun to essentially own it. And so I do feel that is just of huge importance. But it's got its own challenges. I mean, like something like Bitcoin, it seems like this, when it was first starting out, it seemed like, oh, this great way to sort of distribute power of currency away from centralized governments or whatever. But then, of course, the way that Bitcoin itself is mined is one of the most power guzzling new, sources of destruction in our world right now, where, I mean, Bitcoin itself, mining, takes as much power as a mid-sized country, I believe. So, which it gets to this whole notion of capitalism itself. As long as we do anything within this global capitalist structure, what tends to happen is it's almost like a law of capitalism. It's actually called Jevons paradox, which is that any improvement that evolves under, an improvement in efficiency or something that could lead to reduction in usage ends up leading to an increase in usage under capitalism, because then everyone tries to figure out how to make the most money out of it and how to make it as profitable as possible. Which is why the technology is part of the solution, but has to be within that framework of a commons structure. And there's this notion that maybe the commons has this potential of being like that cat's cradle magic that I was talking about earlier, that within, it's almost like within the context, if we imagine global capitalism being this gigantic globe that it seems to encompass everything, within that, rather than outside of it, but within it, we start to create these commons-based structures that, because if they are better, if they actually are more effective and they enliven people in a way that really makes a positive difference, they have this potential to take over from within very quickly and very powerfully, and then sort of absorb the wealth of global capitalism into a different domain that's actually within that same structure. But it's almost like then it starts to reorganize it from inside. I think that's a real potential.
You know, some of the things that when we were talking about earlier about the commons, the airwaves that the radio and television operate on did belong to the people,
Yeah.
but they don't anymore.
Right.
I mean, they've been sold off to corporations.
Yes.
These are things we need to get back in the commons. We need to have control over, and we do not have control over.
Exactly.
I would like to.
Yeah, I think that's exactly to the point you were talking about. Now we've kind of reached the end of the time.
Hold on. I think John had a little bit more to say on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that while I agree with the notion that Bitcoin's use of energy is inefficient, Bitcoin is the proof of concept for a marvel system that has led to an overarching academic and intellectual field. So I would caution not to get hung up on that, because right now newer protocols are deriving the same security elements, you know, that the mechanism that uses all that power in Bitcoin, that gives Bitcoin all that value, that we've deduced how to derive that security with a reduction of power usage by 99.99%. So
yeah. John, a couple questions, if we could, before we move back to you, Georgia. One is, if you could put that Cypherpunk manifesto, a link to it in the chat, I'd love to follow up on that. And secondly, if you could just maybe link to me or just follow up with me directly on what you were just describing. I've been looking to understand what is that solution to that issue. And I'd love it if you could just lead me to to what you were just describing. I
will send you each other's emails.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I would love to get into that, because I totally agree. That's a huge problem. And, you know, it has functionally been, I want to say tentatively been solved.
Yeah, great to hear that. Thank you.
So to be continued for you guys.
Right.
But what I was saying is we've actually reached the end of our book club time. Oh, actually, maybe we haven't. I don't want to overtax you and have you on too long, Jeremy, depending on if there's anything someone really wants to put in at the end here, like a last idea you want to put forth or question you have for Jeremy, this would be the time to do it. Succinctly, not long.
Awesome book. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Sorry. This is minor. What if you were to try to get, you know, my generation who haven't digested anything longer than a tweet in a decade, you know, what's your tagline to, you know, or not, maybe not tagline. How do you approach those people briefly?
Yeah, basically, well, I don't know if you've seen, I've got a 2-minute trailer where I've tried to do just that, basically. So I can put the link to that
in the chat box.
Yeah, in the chat box, because that's sort of been my best my best attempt, if you will, to try to make it bite-sized and available to people. So I'll do that right now.
And Georgia, did you mention the workshop? I saw that you're putting on a 6-week workshop that
yes, thank you for raising that. Let me just just do this quickly, put this link in, and then let me talk to you about the workshop. Because I'd love any of you who wanted to sign up for that to be part of that. Well, there's actually 2 workshops. One is, it's starting about a month from now in early October, is a 4-week workshop on ecological civilization. And I actually did one of these earlier in the year, and it was, there were about 80 people attended over the 4 weeks. It really tremendously alive. People really got excited by it. So that's kind of just like the vision, and really like going into some really deep understanding of what's possible for that ecological civilization. I finished the book, you know, in that final chapter, talking about ecological civilization to some degree. So that's one thing. There's a 6-week actual course on the Web of Meaning, where we're going to look week by week at each of the sections. I'll give a couple of presentations. There'll be conversation like this, but on specifically section by section. And there'll be breakout groups where people will talk together, and larger groups will all get together, and conversation ongoing in a web-based format through that 6 weeks. So a real chance to build community around it. That's going to be beginning on Tuesday, I think November 2nd, something like that, going to early December. If you go to my website, again, I'll give the link. Both of those ongoing workshops are, you can read more about them and sign up for them there.
Great. I'm very glad you brought that up, because I think probably most of us would be interested in this. I certainly am.
Know about the one on ecological civilization. I only knew about the other one. So that's the ecological civilizations on your website. Well,
Yes, that's right. So if you click on that link I just showed you, which is my calendar, you'll see there's an ecological civilization 4-week course, and then you scroll down a little bit more, and you'll see the Web of Meaning, a guided exploration, a 6-week course.
that's what I saw, but I didn't see the other one. Great, wonderful.
Yeah, they both sound fabulous. Thank you for bringing it up, Linda, because I think this group is particularly, and one of the persons who's in our group wasn't able to be here today, so I think he would be interested too. Any last short question or comment? I'm going to bring up one last thing that is kind of irrelevant on one level, but really relevant on another. And it's the definition of chaos, which is not disorder, but it is emptiness or the void, or a place where things can be generated out of. And I think that the binary thinking that we have in our society is that order and disorder and chaos is disorder. In the early Greek, or in the Greek words for disorder and chaos, they're different words and they mean different things. And I just wanted to put that out there, because I think people tend to see chaos as disorder, when really it's a place that is empty but pregnant with possibility.
Yeah, I love that. And it's like we're in a time of chaos right now,
Right.
where it feels like it could be just total disorder, but there's that possibility right there waiting to coalesce.
Indeed.
Beautiful.
So do you have anything you want to tell us, Jeremy?
Well, I think we've kind of talked about so many of these big issues, and I really appreciate, just any just the sense of sharing with you all after you've had a chance to read the book and to like feel into what it's meant for you. And yeah, I guess I would just ask to help spread the word. You might want to do some simple things like just putting a review up on the Amazon website or Goodreads or whatever, or just in the networking or social media network, whatever. I do feel like helping to get the word out around the book. And, it's not so much about me self-aggrandizing again and wanting, more sales or whatever, but I've really come to try to do that discernment myself. I want these ideas to get out there into the world to the extent that we can, because I feel it is like that web of meaning, that it's what each of us are doing to amplify those links is really going to make the difference. So just to invite you all to explore that.
Well, I certainly will put it out to Praxis members, which I have been doing, but I will continue to do. And I think writing a review would be a great idea. So anyone who wants to do that, I will commit to doing that, even though I'm only typing with 2 fingers.
I linked to the Goodreads page. And also, Jeremy, you say your focus is the younger people. I don't know if you've heard of Twitch as a platform.
No, actually.
Okay, so it's basically like live streaming kind of, and there is some like I would say maybe 40,000 concurrent viewers at any time of relatively progressive left-wing political thought. So there is a chunk of younger viewers there that are I would say maybe 2 distillation levels down from the type of stuff that you do and we do at Praxis. But it's like the pipeline for younger people into left-wing thought that I'm cursorily aware of because I use the platform for video games. But there is a whole political section that I think, and in general, we would do better to utilize.
And you just,
Put that in the chat box, John.
Yeah, got it. Sure.
John, do you
That's
just,
great to hear.
you just Google it and it's
Yeah,
like,
just twitch.tv. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
and the person I'm talking about is, I sent Georgia a little clip. He's very crass. He's funny. He's, he's not super serious, but he's knowledgeable. He's educated.
It's
He's,
full of bad language.
you're right. Very crass. I mean, it's for kids, who play video. It's very, informal, but it's the gateway drug to leftism. And that's what I think we need, given the goals of UBI and ecological carbon taxing, Green New Deal type of stuff that an ecological society aims for. I just think that's important to maybe at least be aware of that, of how younger people get into that deeper leftist ideologies.
would a 32-year-old millennial be interested in that, or is he too old already?
32? Do they play video games at all?
He used to. I don't know how much he plays anymore, but
Maybe. They probably have heard of it. They probably don't use it much anymore. Like even me, I don't use it as much anymore. But I know younger than me, that's how younger kids get into. That's how leftists,
I'll ask him. Yeah.
Cute.
All right.
Exactly. Yeah, they call them
Right.
funny. There's funny terms for them. There's a whole subculture and language on that whole platform. It's really interesting. It's like a anthropologist would have a freaking awesome time digging into the subculture that happens when you sequester off those people. But anyway,
It's like another planet.
honestly,
So, yeah, I think you two should probably chat another time too, because it
Yeah,
looks like there's a
definitely.
lot of things that
Yeah.
you can share. Okay, anybody else? This has just been so rich, Jeremy. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
first of all, reading your first book, which our book club did, and now this one. And I know your third one. You want to just tell us what that's going to be about?
Yeah, well, that's going to be on the topic of ecological civilization. So in a way, the next book I'll be writing takes up from where the Web of Meaning leaves off, like this vision of what's possible if we were to truly transform our civilization from one that's wealth affirming and extractive to one that is actually life affirming, but then looking at the real details of what would that actually would look like in everything from the economics to technology to urban design to global governance to education, like really look at the whole lay of the land of what an ecological civilization might be, and then looking at all the people who are actually already working on those elements now and actually starting to lay the foundations for it. So this whole notion that, the future is already here, it's just not very well distributed kind of concept.
Right.
And Matt, it looks like you wanted to say something.
I
on that?
just wanted to mention, I'm not sure, Jeremy, if you're aware of the science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson. Have you
Oh,
read
yeah.
his Ministry for the Future?
Yes.
That's it's a fiction book, but it addresses a lot of the issues you're referring to.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a wonderful exploration of how our culture, our global civilization might just muddle through through catastrophe, or like through the edge of catastrophe to something like the other side. And he's a wonderful thinker. And yeah, I recommend the book.
What was the book you referred to, Matt, that he wrote?
I'll put it in the chat, Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson.
Okay, I didn't read that one, but he lives in Davis.
Yeah, I know. I've read many
Yeah.
of his other books.
I was thinking of trying to get him for a Praxis event.
That'd be
also
great.
just on an editing standpoint, Jeremy, I love how you brought in, like, you chronicled the patterning instinct, and you did a lot. I mean, it was the checkpointing you did was really helpful where at the main questions, and I just thought it was really well, the overarching idea was really well tied through each idea. that just, structurally I helpful.
Oh, thanks so much. It's really great to hear that. Thank you,
All
John.
generations.
I actually have another comment from an older person, and I did book design for 30 years, and it's a really well-designed book for reading. And
Oh,
there's a lot of books that they don't follow the rules of what people's eyes can actually track.
yeah.
And it was just so delightful to pick up this big tome, and it was, the concepts weren't easy, but the type and the language was, so thank you.
Well, great to hear. Lovely to hear
minor
all this
point.
positive feedback.
But
Thank you
tell
so
your
much.
publisher or the book designer, they did a
Yeah.
very good job. And
That
the
checkpointing
gutters are
almost.
perfect. It was just,
Excellent.
what?
Anyone else with
Thank you.
another comment before we?
Wow, that's
Those-
cool. If you zoom now, if you hold thumbs up, it'll do the thumbs up emoji for you. Like it can tell you,
Oh, are you kidding? Really?
or at least it just did for me, I
It
think.
didn't for me. Well, I
Okay.
can't do it with this.
Maybe you've got some secret.
Yeah, you got a
Yeah.
magic
Course.
thing going on. It doesn't work with us.
I'll look into
Well,
that.
Matt
but-
just did it.
You just go to reactions on the bottom of your Zoom screen.
Yeah, okay, well, I know where that is, but just putting
Oh,
my
see,
thumb up.
like
isn't
it just did it. It just did it for me again, but
No, I can't. Oh, Jeffy did it.
I
Yeah.
think he.
Not doing it for me.
I can't do
That's
it.
funny. Anyway, with that, how about a wave?
Yeah, on that
Right.
note.
Great to connect with you all. Such a pleasure.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much, Jeremy.
Yeah,
Thank you
Yeah,
so
thanks,
much.
man.
Thank you.
great
It was
fun.
wonderful.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Beautiful day.
And having the author on these is so awesome, man. Just
Yeah.
really, really just cool. And you never think
We are very lucky when we can get the author. I mean, Jeremy's been a member of Praxis for several years. So, this has been a kind of a long-term focus of how we make systemic change. I think Jeremy's one of the really big thinkers, and George Monbiot of The Guardian has also said that he's one of the great thinkers of our age, of our era. And I totally agree. He certainly is.
Yeah, I'm gonna sign up for that civilization workshop. It's really
it was
good.
a great mix of abstract and practical.
Mhm. Yeah, I really got a sense for where we're going with the dismantling of society and then slowly, a rebuilding. That's kind of what I'm seeing. So
Unraveling.
unraveling, yeah, we're seeing it.
We're living in it.
We are.
Well,
Nice
I
to
can
share with you. Yeah.
Yeah.